This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then notes on resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month.
As the leader of my company, I've had to admit mistakes to people. What I mean, and I certainly have made a lot, and I will make more in the future. There are things and times where you make a judgment call. You're maybe under pressure, maybe you're not, whatever. We all make mistakes, and those mistakes have ramifications sometimes. So it is then my responsibility as a leader to own that and then figure out how do I make it right to the best that I can, right? So that's all I think that it is. Easier said than done.
Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is Cynthia Pong. She's an executive coach and speaker who empowers women of color leaders to advance their careers into positions of power. She's also a Forbes contributor and an author, and we had the best conversation about compassion and leadership, the biggest risk to organizations, how do you measure this, because we know how important that is. And I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Cynthia, I'm so excited that we are recording this conversation of ours.
Me too. I'm delighted to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
To get us kicked off, what is one thing that you've done in any area of your life that you never thought you would do?
Love this question, and I thank you for starting with it because I think it's such an interesting way to not do the usual small talk or what have you. So I thought about this for a while. I was like, what thing do I choose? I'm very bad at choosing one thing only. So my mind kept going back to this one memory, which was hiking the Inca Trail in Peru. So yeah, I did that many years ago now. Can't remember exactly how many years. Also, we talked about how time is like seemingly meaningless now, but I went many years ago with a friend of mine when I was in my first career as a public defender. And it was this big trip that we geared up for literally. And we were there. We were hiking the trail for like, it was like a 4-day hike or something. But we were in Peru for, I think, 2 weeks, like 2 full weeks. But the reason I chose it for the thing I never thought I would do, because one, of course, I thought I would do it at some point because I planned the trip, so it wasn't like a total surprise. But I will say it was one of the hardest things, like, because the altitude is so high there, when you're taking one step, you're like short of breath. And I'm a person that is privileged not to have really felt that many times in my life. And it literally was like, why can't I breathe? Why can't I take this step? It's not that hard because I'm looking at it and I'm like, I've done harder hikes before, but because you're already that high up, I mean, Manya, it was so hard. And like, meanwhile, the 20-year-olds were like bounding ahead and like already at the next rest point. And I was like at the back with my walking sticks. Our delightful guide, who's a woman, Solai, it was very unusual. There was only like a few women who are the guides. Most of them are men. And I still keep in touch with her. She was really kind to just like be at the back with me. But I made it through. It was an incredible experience. I don't know if you're a big outdoorsy person, but
That is incredible that you did that. I am not a big outdoorsy person, but as a friend of mine said, she described herself, I'm not outdoorsy, but I'm outside-y. So I like to be outside, walking, doing things, all sorts of things outside, but I'm not a backcountry, put a pack on my back and sleep in a tent person. Like
That is, so I'm so impressed with people like you who are able to do that. And as you say, the challenge with the Inca Trail is the altitude. So I'm doubly impressed that you were doing that.
I part of me is like, oh, I kind of want to go back because like I went with my one friend and my spouse, didn't get to see it. So like part of me is like, oh, we should go and like do it again. But I'm like, I can't do that now. Like, who am I joking? I Yeah, no,
Yes.
not realistic. Let's just stick to the local hikes around the Hudson area.
Yes, exactly. Like a day pack, I can do that. I can do the day pack.
Yeah, something more flat. That's kind of my speed now.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. And I think that ties a little bit into our conversation on compassion and empathy and having compassion for ourselves and recognizing when we can and can't step out of our comfort zone. When we're talking about compassion in an organizational context, we're thinking about workplaces or other organizations. What do you think is the first step that an organization to take to embed compassion into the culture? Especially because we've got a lot of organizations that we can look at now that historically have been more transactional or hierarchical, which is antithetical to compassion.
Yeah, right. So I thought about this and I took it very literally, your question. And so and I also believe in like micro steps and really trying to, baby step into things, especially if it is a big change. Because we live in so much chaos already at baseline. Everyone is like so stressed out. Like you don't know who's got what past traumas. Like it's really intense right now. So that's also demonstrating and showing compassion for other people and where they're at. So the first step is to accept and to know, recognize, and accept that it's going to be messy. Like this process you're about to embark on, it's going to be messy. You're going to make mistakes or feel like you made mistakes. And it might be mistakes in air quotes or it might be mistakes. But I think it's actually kind of like the radical first step is to acknowledge that and to try to continually embrace that because in so doing, you are embedding thread of compassion and a through line of that from the very beginning, which is that like you're trying to embark on a new thing. It's going to be very different. You don't know how it's going to look. None of us have a crystal ball. And it could look any number of ways. You might also have, like, it could be a tough journey. Some unexpected negative things could happen along the way. But like, if we don't hold that compassion for ourselves and each other and what we're trying to do jointly, then it's kind of like, well, what is the point anyway? And also to be clear, I'm not suggesting that people flip from like, okay, you have a hierarchical org chart and culture like completely to like a flat organization, overnight or whatever. I forget the kind of org structure is very rare, but it's like pods, and like I think it was like that shoe company. Oh, of course I'm forgetting the name, but like
Oh,
it was like
Zappos?
yeah, yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's not oligarchy. It's like so oligopoly or something like that. There's some term where it's like pods of decision making or something. I'm not suggesting that that's doable for frankly most organizations, but like the first step, understand it's going to be messy. And then I think two is like come up with a plan, like your first plan. Like kind of if you're writing, you do the like shitty first draft. Like what is your version of that for a plan of how you are going to embark on this transition? And really, I think it has to come down to just talking about it. So let me stop there because it was a lot. What do you think?
Well, one of the traps I think any of us get caught up in when making a change is seeing the end goal and realizing it's a lot of work to get from point A to point Z and forgetting that really the first step is point A to point B. And that can be, as you said, pulling together a plan that doesn't have to be perfect, or the first step could literally be deciding that this is what you want to do.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. Yep.
And certainly organizations these days like to be moving fast, and if they're public organizations, they've got quarterly results they need to be showing. And so I think there's this bias for we want to do this thing fast and we want to see results instantaneously. And I think that causes some fear about, even if you thought you wanted to build more compassion in or change the culture. I think there's fear around that because of it's not going to show results in 3 months.
Right. I know. And how do you even go about thinking of how do you measure it? You know what I mean? It's not something necessarily like that. I mean, I would argue you can absolutely measure it, but it is something that takes time. And I think we had talked about kind of before this, there is that pressure. I think it's not only fear, it's also a lot of stress around it, which is again antithetical to what this endeavor is kind of at its core. But understanding that a lot of companies with the culture that they have and or I don't know, I guess the commitments that they have made to shareholders, to whoever, the board, et cetera, it just it makes it extremely challenging, I'll just say, to put it lightly, to embark on this because yeah, like they just want what are the results? What is the productivity? What all that stuff.
Right. And we're going to get a little deeper into the measurement in a little bit, but it's not a straight line. Build compassion for every compassionate word you say, you build one more widget. It's not a direct line. One thing I've been talking a lot with leaders recently is the concept of vulnerability, because I think that is basis for building a culture where your employees trust you, and thus that is the basis of the compassionate culture. And I think that is something that's very hard for any human, definitely hard for leaders.
I mean, if there's any Brene Brown heads out here, like, yeah, I think it really underpins the whole kind of idea around this. But like, you can't, in order to do the brave thing and try to shift how our workplaces are, do anything that goes kind of against the grain, um, we do have to, I think we do have to be vulnerable because otherwise you're going to be fake. And if you are fake in how you talk about things, people pick up on the inauthenticity, and that does not build trust. It, in fact, breaks trust. And there's already so little built-in trust in companies and organizations today, Manya. Like, I think my first Forbes article for the leadership strategy, like contributor column that I write, was about how the psychological contract at work is completely broken. Like post-pandemic, there's no more feeling of like, yeah, we get that this is a transaction. I'm coming here to do this work in exchange for the pay. But like, there's no feeling that employers are ever going to actually help and support their employees when things go sideways, because we saw what happened in the pandemic and we saw, we're experiencing what's happening now. And so that trust is so broken. And I think, I mean, it's going to take a long time, I think, to rebuild that, but you have to center the vulnerability at the beginning of that because it requires that you acknowledge that we went through this reality where I would argue mistakes were made, which I'm not against mistakes. We're human. But that's the entire thing about it. We have to be able to own that, because if we're going to pretend it wasn't, that we did not make some mistakes along the way, you're just breaking the trust more and more. What do you want? You're never going to have an engaged workforce. You're never going to have people that want to go hard for your company mission, and you're just going to churn them out. So
I so appreciate what you say about mistakes. I see such a fear to own up to making a mistake when we all do it. And certainly some mistakes have more serious consequences than others. Absolutely. And yet I have so much more respect for someone in whatever role, in whatever level of our society or an organization, who owns up to, oops, that's not what we intended. Let's fix it. I'm sorry. I don't know if we ever had that, but it feels like if we did, it certainly has been lost.
yeah, I'm not going to lie here. I'm going to say part of it is because I'm a trained lawyer. I don't practice anymore, but I became a lawyer so I could be a public defender. I think a lot of it has to do with lawyers and how litigious we are. Because if you say something like, I'm sorry, it can, and depending on the situation, like it will come back to bite you in a lot of ways. And I think that that's a real pragmatic, tricky position that a lot of leaders are in. Like, I understand that point of view as well. Like, sometimes there are things that you cannot say, or that you can't really say directly, or that, legal won't let you say, or like, what, you know what I mean? So I fully understand that. And I also have empathy and compassion for that, because this is a system we're all in. We did not individually build this thing. We are now in it We are all kind of to varying degrees forced to be complicit in it. Some of us are, in different places with that, but it's not a blame game either. And I want to make like that's very antithetical to the compassion approach as well. But like also you can have accountability and you can have um dare I say reconciliation in these processes. I mean, I will just say also, like, I know I talk a good game around this, but as the leader of my company, I've had to admit mistakes to people. You know what I mean? And I certainly have made a lot, and I will make more in the future. There are things and times where you make a judgment call. You're maybe under pressure, maybe you're not, whatever. We all make mistakes, and those mistakes have ramifications sometimes. So it is then my responsibility as a leader to own that and then figure out how do I make it right to the best that I can. Right. So that's all I think that it is. Easier said than done.
Absolutely. As you were talking about lawyers and our litigious society, it reminded me I had a conversation with somebody in an industry who specifically said, we on the front lines who deal with customers are prohibited from saying these kinds of things because it would open us up to lawsuits, even though these kinds of things are the things that the people calling us need to hear and want to hear. But we are prohibited from saying that because it would open us up to a lawsuit. And I certainly can't change that whole industry, but it just feels, as you said, we are all in a system that none of us individually made, but we all contribute to, and we are all the recipients of. And it can be so hard to make those changes. And I know you and I both talk about making systemic changes, and it feels like we're pushing that boulder up the hill sometimes.
Say most of the time. But at the same time, like, doesn't mean we don't, keep trying. And that it's kind of like resilience strategies for people who are doing this too. We got to make sure that we fill our cup and, we don't burn ourselves out and things like that in the process. But I love this example of what you're saying. I think it's a really great opportunity to talk about middle spaces or like middle ways, third ways, etc. Because sure, if that customer service person cannot say these five things or whatever the long list is, probably 500, but they can't say those five things. They want to still support this client or customer. Also, they know that it's good for business if they do. What are the other ways that they can still do that? So at a bare minimum, I think that we bring a certain approach, energy, vibe, however you talk about it, to an interaction. Even if it's typing through a text, even if it's, through a screen or what, we bring something to that. So I feel like for, the person who's frustrated because they're like, I can't say this to my direct report, but I actually really want them to know. But like, if I say this, someone's going to come down on me, right? Like, if you are simply there with the energy that is supportive to this person, and you give them space for them to speak and be heard and know that they are seen by you and that you hear them, right? The customer service, client service person could do that as well, right? Like things that are just like, I hear that, or like, whatever they're allowed to say, right? Like, but the version of that that's really neutral, that is just neutral, affirming that you hear and see them at baseline, I actually think that can go a long way.
Agreed. I think it was more traditional in the past that work was work and home life was you left it at the door. And now it's much more that people are expecting work to be a community. And when we are part of a community that doesn't recognize what's going on with me individually, whether that's trauma, which is something I think about a lot, or regular old stress. But if I'm in a community and it doesn't recognize that, then I don't want to be part of that community anymore.
I think that is what a lot of people are grappling with is the sense that, yeah, in a way, and it's something I've like thought about and wrote about in the Forbes article too, but it's like we want our team members, our employees in our companies, we want them to kind of like go hard for the company, basically, right? Like do your best, advance the work, be productive, engaged, etc. Like move the needle on all of this forward for the company. But it's like, then if you're going, it's almost like there's like a predictably unpredictable or something is like a book from years ago about like behavioral psychology and stuff. I don't know if you ever read that book,
I
but
did not.
I need to go back and reread it or just revisit this part. But one thing that stuck out in my head was that when you combine social and transactional dynamics, weird things happen. So like
Yes.
for example, if I was like, Manya, do you want to come over to my house for dinner? And you came over for dinner, and then at the end I presented you with a bill as if you were at a restaurant.
Hmm.
Okay, things would get weird,
They would
right?
very quickly.
Alternatively, if you went to a restaurant and you were like, thanks for having me over, and then you left without paying, also weird, right? So I was thinking about that when you were describing this, because this idea of like community work, it creates like this mishmash of expectations. And I'm not saying either way is like right or wrong. I don't think it's like that at all. It's kind of just like, what is the reality that we're in? Expectation on one side is that this is more going to be like this sort of exchange, but on the other side, it's treated like this sort of exchange. Those two things being different, you're going to have issues.
Absolutely. And I think we are having issues, and that's one of the things that we're seeing in the workplace. Now, do you think we're doing a good job in leadership development, whether that's within an organization or in formal education, in preparing leaders to be compassionate within their organizations?
Oh, no, I do not. That's not to be like hypercritical, because I can't even think of most of the time I hear from our clients and community, clients on both sides, like they don't even have basic first time manager training. So if we were to talk about how to be a compassionate leader, I mean, aside from the work you're doing, I really struggle to think of where that would be happening. And, of course, at Embrace Change, we have like a leadership accelerator, and like it's kind of embedded in like our approach, but, we're on the fringe, right? Like, I'm not going to pretend like we're kind of in the middle of the mix of it all, but I don't think we do nearly enough about that. I think one of the big missteps is, even when we think about leadership development, we are thinking only about those skills and the tools, like the same kind of frameworks and rubrics from decades ago that I think are really outdated for nowadays, where it's just like, you're this kind of leader and you're that kind of leader, like your leadership style or like whatever, things like that, that I don't know they really apply so much nowadays, where workforces are distributed. You've got five generations in the workplace. Like, it was my frustration actually with like not finding leadership frameworks that I felt like resonated with our clients, that I created a leadership styles, like a personalized style, like BuzzFeed style personality quiz thing for leadership styles that specifically speaks to women of color and non-binary people of color and stuff. But I think there's a lot of room for improvement there, basically. And I'll stop because that was a lot.
No, that was great. And I do see that challenge. As you said, I find it interesting. People will say, yeah, I think compassion is important, but it's not something we invest in. And I understand that, because to get back to what you were talking about earlier about the measurement, I think it is difficult for companies to recognize how it's going to bring them value and be better for the bottom line, because there isn't that direct connection. So, what metrics or indicators do you use and do you recommend for organizations when they're trying to measure how to embed compassion in their culture?
I love this because I'm also big into like, let's measure things. You're not going to know where you're at, and you're not even going to be able to see like the wins along the way if you don't have some kind of measurement, right? Because our feelings can change like the direction of the wind. So one thing here that I think is like a big bucket is that's connected to the compassion in the workplace is, you will see, like, if in a workplace that has a practice, I won't say culture, I'll just say practice of compassion, you're going to have more increased psychological safety. That's what I have found. That's what I think is kind of like an implied finding from like Google's Aristotle project that they did a couple years ago, where they were like, the most productive teams, that the number one factor is they had high psychological safety, by which I mean, people on teams felt safe to ask questions, to ask real questions, to ask questions that someone else might be afraid was a quote unquote dumb question, to make mistakes, to take a risk, knowing that if they did that and things went sideways, they would not be shamed, they would not be punished, they would not be judged, they would not be mocked, all of that kind of thing, which I think again is very closely tied to this entire like compassion culture and practice thing. So one thing you could do is you could look at, okay, when we have a team meeting, let's say we start, in January of one year, just get baseline, right? Before you kind of start anything. In a typical team meeting with this particular team, how many questions are being asked and what are those questions? And you just write them down or whatever. Like, if you're using your AI note taker, like it'll be in there, what have you. And then maybe once a month when you have this meeting, you like keep measuring that. And then you can kind of see, and I bet you will see there, like over time, there's going to be some evolution there. Either, the number of questions might change or the type of questions might change. Like if you look at that data, I know it's not exactly, well, it is actually both quantitative and qualitative. If you look at that, you're going to find something. And it's like, even if you don't, then like you've got other metrics too, right? So I think there's that at a larger org level, looking at churn. Are people staying? Are people leaving? Are people who are staying, is their productivity going down? Because there's a lot of people now, because of how the job market is, they're not necessarily leaving, but you're not getting their best work, not by a long stretch. They're just there because they know what the job market is like and they're biding their time till they can leave. So, like looking at numbers like that, of course, it can be confounded by other factors, but those type of things are where I would start. What about you?
Yes. Well, what you said, the meeting, the measuring the questions in the meeting, I think is brilliant because that absolutely gets at, do people feel safe and to ask questions, and then do they feel safe to challenge you and ask those deeper questions? And I also like the measurement of turnover because it seems to me that high turnover almost only says you aren't a psychologically safe organization and you don't have trust and you don't have compassion because, there's certainly people turn over for sort of, I'm going to quote, regular reasons. But it seems to me if you've got a high turnover, it's entirely because they're dissatisfied with the way they're being treated in the company or by their manager, right? We hear that people don't leave the company, they leave their manager. But that makes it all the more important to be training our managers on how to manage and to do so with compassion and empathy. All right. Well, we are almost at the end of our time.
It went so fast.
I know it went so fast. Well, tell me, what do you think is the biggest risk to an organization if they don't embrace compassionate leadership?
Also want to loop in something that I thought of just now when you were sharing, which is that I think there are some business models, to be totally honest, where the business model is to churn people out very quickly, at least out of some roles, but not out of all roles. So there's some nuance there. And I'm not like condoning that as a business model either, but I just think that that's kind of part of the reality in some places. But there are costs to that too, which ties me back into the answer to this question, which is there's serious costs to like not thinking about, not even asking the question, or like at least setting an intention to try to be like a little bit more compassionate in the leadership and in the culture at the workplace, which is that you're going to lose out on talent. Like you are not going to get your A plus plus talent for those positions that, I know, like you're not going to have A plus plus talent in like every single role, nor do most organizations necessarily need that, but you do need it in key places. And if you don't have some of that, there's going to be people who will vote with their feet and they will go to your competitor because the competitor has a better culture. You're also going to burn people out faster. Like if there's no understanding of the real life hardship, past trauma, current trauma that people are going through, 100%, 90% of their thinking during the day when they're on the clock for you is how are they going to get out of there and when. And then I'll say the third thing is we are on the cusp of, or like in the middle of this kind of silver tsunami where a lot of people with a lot of knowledge and organizational, institutional knowledge and value are retiring, or they're going to retire soon. And we've got Gen Z coming up, and they're very different. They're very different from millennials, different from, I mean, I'm like on the cusp, but I'm culturally more like Gen X. So there's like a lot going on there, and there's different expectations and demands for different kind of groups, I think kind of roughly ages of people. So the trend, like values is extremely important to Gen Z, like even more so than the young millennials, and they will let you know. So it's kind of like leadership beware. If you don't have a plan for how you're going to bridge that, you're going to have you're going to have the vacuum in the leadership, and then you're going to have a bunch of people who are there who are just completely not equipped to take on the leadership mantle that you need them to. and that's going to ripple out.
Absolutely. So, what is giving you hope right now?
That's not the $1 million question. Like, I'm very aware that I need to find ways to fill my cup because as someone who naturally is sort of a pessimist, plus I'm a New Yorker, plus I still have lawyer brain in my head. Like, I'm very quick to see the negative, you know what I mean? But like in the work that I do, the coaching, the like employee engagement work, like the training, my cup is filled when I talk to like people like you who really get it, when we're doing work where I can literally see that we are, if not actively making things better in that moment, which I would argue we are at least making things less worse for people. You know what I mean? Because our team can't go in for any engagement and just like wave a magic wand and change the culture and the systems that particular team is in, for example. But we can help them feel supported. Like we can communicate to them that they matter. We can show them that they are seen and that they are heard and that they are stronger than they think and that they bring so much value, even more than they're not just like, the sum of their labor that they can provide for a company. That's the stuff that gives me hope and that keeps me going because I know that that's going to be increasingly more important as we go into this future.
Absolutely. And that's the perfect thought for us to wrap up. So, Cynthia, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your wisdom with my listeners.
Thank you so much, Manya. This has been really, really great. And thank you for doing all the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I'm Manya Chilinsky. I help organizations build compassionate, resilient teams that thrive by creating environments where well-being is at the core. Often people reach out to me during times of crisis or significant change, but the truth is that building a healthier, more supportive workplace can prevent issues before they arise and empower your teams to thrive no matter what challenges come their way. If you're ready to make a meaningful change, I'd love to connect. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcast or your listening platform of choice. It really helps others find us. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, connect with me on LinkedIn or visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com. Thank you for being part of this journey with me.